Payton has been in the field of power-based intervention and prevention for over 10 years in various roles and states, getting their start in this field as a Bells Against Violence Student Advisory Committee member. We are so excited to have Payton back on campus. Please welcome Payton Moore.
Can everyone hear me? I'm a little taller. There we go. So thank you everybody for having me today. We're going to talk a little bit about DEI considerations. I do have handouts. I have a packet. I do ask that you just keep it on the front page. And then I also have some blank wheels. Just 1 second.
Here, I'll do that.
Okay, perfect. One of each. Okay, so for our agenda today, we're kind of going to go over just a brief introduction of myself, a general overview of some terms that to kind of create a common ground. And then we're going to do a couple deep dives into expanding our thoughts and our knowledge and our understanding of what power-based personal violence looks like across various communities. And you can see up here we have BIPOC, immigration, and the LGBTQIA community. I will start off by saying that I had to cut down this presentation a lot, and I don't think I did enough. So we might not get to everything. That's totally fine. I'd rather have conversation that's fruitful. But if anyone is interested in the full presentation, I do have my contact information and I can absolutely send it out. I just like to pre-warn. So a little bit about myself. As Monica said, I am Payton. I am originally from Hammond, Indiana, woo. But I came here in 2011 and I graduated in 2015. My real passion from there, I developed here, was around gender-based violence and around gender women's studies. So from here, my time at St. Mary's as a student advisory committee member, as a volunteer at St. Joseph, the SOS at the Family Justice Center, there we go. I went to the University of Cincinnati for my master's. There I really looked at the LGBT community's relationship with the DSM, and then also more policies and procedures for academic and workplace environments. From there, I did go to the University of Kentucky for 3 grueling long years in the PhD program. I do not have my PhD, so you know how that turned out. But essentially, COVID hit. I realized I was miserable. My activist self had basically died, and I was behind a chair crying, as my husband can attest, for hours on end trying to write. So I left. And I ended up at a nonprofit in Kentucky, and that's really where I found my calling. I am a hospital supervisor now at Women Helping Women. So anytime someone goes to the hospital after being sexually assaulted or a domestic violence incident, I'm there or someone from my team is there to walk them through the medical process, legal process, provide on-the-spot counseling. Sometimes that looks like calling family and friends or a spouse if they don't feel like they can do it themselves. Sometimes that's going to the courthouse with them the next morning to get an EPO. It's a very mixed bag of a job. It can be very difficult, but it is incredibly important for the direct service realm. And that's where I center myself, is really looking at direct service and how we can best serve survivors who walk through the door, regardless of their social identities or where they come from, but understanding that their social identities impact the way in which that they involve themselves with violence and how that looks once they're going through it. And I really come from a trauma-informed lens, which turns the question from like what happened to, or what's wrong with you, to what happened to you and what are your lived experiences and how can we work together. I will say too, for this event, we're talking about some heavy stuff, right? Particularly for this event, we're talking about sexual violence, power-based violence, very heavy topics. And also we'll be talking about things like homophobia and racism, also heavy topics. So if anybody needs to step out at any point, temporarily, the whole time, that's totally fine. Please take care of yourself and please have the space for yourself and for everybody else in the room to feel comfortable. We will be doing some activities. You're not gonna have to get up, I promise. I'm not like that bad of a person. But you will have to talk just a little bit about wheels. So just as a forewarning to those of you who are already a little bit annoyed. This is a poem I like to start off with just to center myself and for everybody to center. I won't read this out loud unless somebody really wants me to, just because I feel like everyone reads at their own speed. But this poem I use to start off my trainings with my volunteers. I think it shows really what we need to be focusing on when we're talking about serving survivors. There's no perfect survivor. Every survivor is individual and has their own story to tell, and it's us as service providers' job to meet them where they're at into the system with what they need at that time. I'm never going in and telling them this is what you need to do. I go in, I present options and say, okay, let's talk about what you would like to do. So I'll give everybody just a minute or two to kind of look this over. Does anybody need a little bit more time? Okay. So just very generally, to describe a term, right? Power-based personal violence is a term that's used. It's a broad term. It means, right, it's any form of violence where the primary motivator is that assertion of power and control or intimidation, to harm another human being. So the term itself is broad. You have partner violence, or most commonly referred to as domestic violence. Sexual violence, so things like contact sexual violence, like rape, sexual assault, and also non-contact, so things like catcalling, public exploitation, that sort of thing. We also work with stalking survivors, human trafficking survivors, child abuse, elder abuse, harassment, and bullying. So we do know that any person can experience any one of these incidents, and power-based personal violence impacts people, right, regardless of race, religion, gender, sexuality, orientation, whatever our social categories may be, it impacts everybody. That's not to say, though, that it doesn't impact people at a higher rate or that they're at a higher risk. But also, right, power-based personal violence can affect people differently from their identities. So just looking at this, it's important to kind of center ourselves in what this term means and working forward. To get a little bit more narrow about intimate partner violence, domestic violence is just a term that we use now to include those who are not living together, not married, dating relationships, that sort of thing, so intimate partner violence. This is a pattern of abusive behaviors in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over another intimate partner. So this can be physical, sexual, emotional, economic, psychological. This can include really any behaviors that intend to intimidate, manipulate, humiliate, frighten, right, terrorize, anything that could hurt somebody with that exertion of power. So talking about power and power-based personal violence, I feel like most people probably know that power and control wheel is one of the most common ways to talk about violence in relationships, but also broadly applying to bullying as well. So the Duluth model is probably the most common batterer intervention program used in the United States. It is named after Duluth, Minnesota, the city where it was developed. So it is based on this feminist theory, positioning that domestic violence is the result of patriarchal ideology in which men are encouraged and expected to control their partners. So they interviewed a bunch of women at the time to look at patterns of abuse and what that looks like. So I think on the handout, the first page you have is the power and control wheel, the base one, and just really quickly, I'm gonna kind of go through and highlight some of it, and also frame a way in which we can think about this. We will be spending more time with the wheel. This is just kind of a brief overview. So when thinking about using intimidation, we're looking at how to make somebody afraid, right? So you could be smashing things, destroying property, harming pets is a big one as well, displaying weapons. And what we want to try to think of these things, right, is using intimidation, think of them as binders. They're binding the survivor to their abuser through threats, right, through scaredness of their own safety. So with emotional abuse, we're talking about put downs, name calling, mind games. Humiliation is a very big tactic as well. And this idea of making someone feel guilty. So think of this as that control aspect, that emotional control of feeling guilty. So this could be based upon anything of that survivor. This is where you will see some identity factors come in, and we'll talk about a little bit. And kind of going along with emotional abuse is using isolation. So this is controlling what someone does, who they see, what they read, where they go, limited outside environment, jealousy as justification, separation of friends and family. This is where an abuser is trying to isolate that survivor so they have nowhere to go. We do tend to think of this process as the idea of normalizing. So with using isolation, all the survivor tends to know then is that abuse, and that starts to feel more and more normal as time goes on. With minimalizing, denying, and blaming, this is making light of the abuse. It can be saying it didn't happen, shifting responsibility of like, well, you did this, so this is why I did that. Saying that the survivor caused this. We think of this as that Jedi mind trick, right, for those of you who are Star Wars fans. So thinking about how that is warping their reality, warping their perception of what's happening and what's going on. Another big one is using children, guilt feeling about children, using them to relay messages back and forth. When we help survivors get protection orders, we do have to make sure to include children because some abusers will use the child to give messages to the survivor of abuse. You also could be using visitation to harass them, threatening to take the kids away. We also think about using children as the tie that binds the survivor to the abuser. It's a lot harder to leave, it's a lot harder to separate. Sometimes family gets involved when there is a child involved as well. When thinking of using male privilege, we're thinking about treating the survivor like a servant, maybe making all of the big financial decisions. This idea of that master of the castle, the master of the house, and also using really defining gender roles. And thinking about economic abuse, right, this is preventing them from getting or keeping a job, asking for money, giving them an allowance or taking that money, and also just disallowing access to family income. What people I think don't realize unless that they're in the field, sometimes because media doesn't portray this as much, is there's always some sort of economic abuse going on in an intimate partner violence situation. There is some way in which that survivor feels that they are not financially stable enough to leave, or they're not even able to because they don't have any money of their own. The abuser controls everything. So this is where it gets tricky with service provision and thinking about how we can best assist a survivor who has nothing to their name at the current moment. So thinking really quickly about criticism of wheel and kind of where this presentation starts off today is that critics argue that the method can be ineffective as it was developed without minority communities in mind and can fail to address root psychological or emotional causes of abuse, in addition to completely neglecting male survivors of abuse. And that is definitely valid and fair, and thankfully, since this has come out, amazing academics and professionals in the field have created DEI wheels that take the power and control wheel and then frame it and view it through the lens of an identity. And so while we know that intimate partner violence affects people from all walks of life, we also know that it can more deeply affect individuals from certain communities or backgrounds. And specific communities may also have different ways of approaching domestic violence as well as increased barriers to support services. And that's really what we're going to dive into and look at today. So I come from this as a professional in the field, and what that means to me is thinking about cultural competence. So this is that commitment to learning from, having and demonstrating respect for, and accepting all individuals as unique, important human beings whose individuality and experiences are equally as valid. So cultural competence is incredibly important, right, in thinking about us as service providers and how we can make sure that we are adequately serving those who walk in our door from a cross-cultural context. What that means too is, right, is this constant willingness to learn from another, to allow individuals to always be the expert on his or her their own life, and for us to conduct ourselves as individuals, advocates, and organizations accordingly. So kind of keeping that even further, right, as advocates in a crisis setting, we are and we have a limited opportunity to provide support to survivors that we encounter. For me personally, right, my experience with survivors and my interaction is at the hospital, and then at hospital follow-ups when I'm calling them later. My interaction stops there. So the quality of the support that we have can really impact that survivor's recovery process moving forward. If I and my team are first on the scene, right, we are going to be the first people that they're talking to from our organization. And so we need to eliminate, to every extent possible, barriers in understanding and accessibility that would hinder our ability to provide that support. And that's really where I frame my logic from, is how can we best serve all survivors who are walking through the door. Just as a hint too on intersectionality and power-based personal violence, intersectional diverse care recognizes that everyone should be treated with dignity and respect. So looking through this lens, it helps build services that are appropriate for everyone and their individuality. I'm sure people know what intersectionality is, right? But thinking about that interconnected nature of social categorizations, such as race, class, gender, disability, and other identities, as they apply to an individual or group, and regarded, right, as creating this overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So it's important to note that in the upcoming sections, I will be talking about specific underrepresented populations individually, but I want to give recognition, right, that they intersect. It's just we don't have enough time to go into that. But for example, right, if we're looking at a gay man has to face homophobia, a black man faces racism, a black gay man, right, would be feeling and witnessing them both at the same time. So when I say the term underrepresented populations, right, this is groups of people with factors in common that experience elevated risk for poor health status and reduced access for support. So they may experience significant disparities in many health and opportunity indicators, including partner and sexual violence problems. So when we're thinking of barriers, right, I'm really talking about this from an aspect of barriers to service. So what is stopping people from walking through our doors? This could look at lack of representation in agency outreach efforts and materials. This could look at unwelcoming, implicitly biased, or stereotype supportive messaging. It also can boil down to unknowledgeable staff, ill-equipped to understand culturally unique experiences. This does require energy from the client to bridge that gap, which is incredibly not fair in that space and in that time. And we also may have some barrier-reducing policies and philosophies of service provision that are poorly advertised or unknown to the community. For example, when I was at the Ion Center in Kentucky, we have a strong Hispanic population in the community, but we were not seeing those numbers walking through our door at all. And we all know that violence happens, so where is the disconnect? It turns out a lot of our Spanish pamphlets had way too much language on them, and it was muddled and messy and not very informative or helpful. We had to outsource and get some help on that. But if someone hadn't caught that, right, we would have never known, because none of us at our agency had spoke Spanish except one person. So it's ways in which that we have to educate ourselves, think about what problems are having and how we can address those to better serve survivors in different parts of the community. So the first thing we're going to talk about is BIPOC. This is Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. This term acknowledges the unique and specific violence, cultural erasure, and discrimination experienced by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, in the United States. Each group within BIPOC experiences different types of violence that are specific to their racial and cultural identity and have a different historic, social, and cultural relationship with whiteness. So this is from, I think, 2018. Okay, that's good. Some of our stats are a little bit outdated. The data comes out slowly, and COVID really messed with the releasing of updated data. So as you can see here, right, this is estimate of intimate partner violence by race, ethnicity, and sex. I will say that statistics are incredibly helpful, data is incredibly helpful. However, with this field, it also will never be 100% accurate. A lot of survivors will not come forward, especially when we're looking at sexually identified race or ethnicity, because of barriers to service, barriers to reporting, systemic racism, all that sort of stuff. And so when we're looking at these stats, it's really important to understand them, but to also recognize that it's probably not the full picture. Give everybody a second just to look at this a little bit. So as you can see, right, we have higher rates of violence in different communities, and that can stem from economic impacts from systemic racism, sectioning, any sort of cultural difference. So this could come from. So when we're thinking of general overview of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in our community who are survivors, we're looking at barriers to service. And this is just a little bit more of a broad application, and we'll break this down. But when we're thinking of barriers to service, we're thinking about what is stopping a survivor from coming through our door, what is stopping them from calling us the hospital, because it's their choice whether or not we're there. What is happening and why? So you're looking at keeping the pressure to keep issues within the family or community, to not involve outsiders, right? Protecting that family unit. The pressure to stay, to not rely, and to not report. Right? So looking at those non-institutional supports. Thinking about cultural expectations and pressure concerning that family structure, individual sacrifice to family, or just gender roles. That strong male cultural expectations that inhibit male survivors in particular. A lack of available resources that reflect the race, culture, and experiences of the victim survivor. And also, of course, right, the fear that their abuser may be brutalized, killed by the police, or deported. I cannot tell you the amount of times I've been in the hospital with somebody and they don't want to report because they don't want their abuser to be involved with the police. So thinking about that, right, how that impacts themselves as a survivor, and how that there's that extra pressure on them to think about that at that time is something that we're trying to help address. So when thinking about service provision implications, right, what does this look like for those of us who work in this field? So we always want to invite clients to share our expectations and apprehensions, research our experiences, beliefs, and practices which we're not familiar, right, continually to educate ourselves. And of course, right, you don't want to assume race or ethnicity based on appearance. You don't want to question experiences, beliefs, or practices. That's not your role. And you don't want to pressure clients to adjust expectations or desired actions based on your own belief. A survivor is telling you they cannot do this because of whatever is happening in their life. That's not for us to say, no, you're wrong, you're doing this anyways. It's for us to say, okay, let's figure out how we can work with that. So kind of as a focus point, I wanted to talk about immigrant survivors. So immigrant victim survivors face cultural differences and barriers which abusers may use to their advantage. So immigrant survivors may believe that they have no rights, they have no way out, and no help. These challenges apply to victim survivors living in the United States regardless of documentation status. It's also unfortunate that immigrants are particularly underrepresented in prevalent studies of intimate partner violence and sexual violence, especially when they're undocumented. So we don't really have specific numbers to report. However, we do know it's happening, it's there just from being on the ground. So this is where we jump to our first activity. In your, not in the packet, I'm so sorry, you should have 2 pages of 2 blank wheels. Everybody have 2 blank wheels? So we'll get those. So what this is going to be is, this is the point where you do have to interact with somebody. I'm so sorry. But I need you to find a group of people, 1 person, doesn't really matter, and I want you to think about with immigration and immigrants in mind, what could that upgraded power control wheel look like? So, right, for minimizing the blame, right, what are some specific instances or barriers that you could think of that person facing? It is okay if you don't know any. We actually have a completed wheel in the packet if you are stuck and you would like to look. Try to kind of think for a second though and see if you can come up with anything. There's no wrong answer. This is a co-learning experience, so next to you might not have a clue. And this is kind of a forced way to co-learn, so I'm sorry about it, but we're gonna take about a couple minutes, go over, see how much you can talk, figure out, and then we're gonna take a deep dive together to actually look at it. You can go ahead. Okay, great. Thank you all for your cooperation. I know an early morning activity is never a good time, but really what I wanted to think about is what do some groups have? I know that it's up here, but I kind of want to hear if anybody wanted to kind of contribute of what y'all talked about, or something on the wheel that you kind of thought you should be adding to this consideration. Is anybody courageous enough to share? I'm not going to force y'all, but. Yeah, Kristen.
So I think when we were talking about caregiver/isolation, it was a family separation. So you might have family here, and you might have family in another country. So just that distant connection between family members.
Yeah, absolutely right. That's a really good point to bring out, is that isolation. If you do have a family that is not in this country, right, that abuser has a very quick and easy almost time, right, to start that isolation process at an intenser and a higher level, right, or a higher level of progression. Anybody else, anything that they thought about? Yeah, go ahead.
We talked about maybe with isolation, if they don't speak English, not allowing them to learn English.
Yeah, it's a very good point too, right? If they don't speak English, and even coming from a service provider lens, like we have places we can call. However, right, especially thinking about our courts and our court system, that sometimes is not always easily accessible or available at the times needed. So that can be a big barrier as well. Anybody else? I have to leave over to see some of these myself. Right, but thinking about this in terms of immigration, you can kind of see the different ways in which those original ideas from the Duluth model kind of get expanded upon. So in particular, the ones that kind of stand out to me in terms of what we've seen is that threatening to report them to get them deported. That fear, even if somebody is an immigrant that is not undocumented but documented, there's still that fear that something can jeopardize that. And a lot of immigrants who are survivors, it stops there with them not wanting our services because they feel that we're a connection to immigration or to the police department and that we're not a separate entity. We've had to do a lot of time in the community to be like, hey, no, we are separate. You can come to us, and as long as there's not instances of elder abuse or child abuse that we are legally required to report, right, that can stay with us. So thinking about that lens as well. Anybody else have anything that they want to discuss or add? Yeah, go ahead.
For like withhold, misuse or delays convenience supports, maybe if they started like residency documentation, they're like withholding, giving certain documents or going to meet with a lawyer, going to courts and hearings, because it's delaying the process too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly, right. Thinking about the documents, delaying going to the courts, hiding those documents of immigration, the process of what that involves. We see this a lot with immigration status, but also even just with normal driver's license, right? The abuser is taking that identification information. And, right, that is hard and annoying if you're from this country, right? But if you're not, that can be even more tricky and difficult to get another copy if you can, if you're allowed to. So thinking about that layer as well. Anybody else? I'm trying to keep up the course of time. I think I saw another hand over here. No? Okay.
The thing that struck me, we didn't come up with it, but using language.
Yeah.
I think in part because I have a daughter who immigrated to Sweden, and it gained an appreciation for just how isolating it can be when you don't know that language. I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, language is really, really important, and like we all do try our best, right? But we can't always serve to the best of abilities. So there are a lot of resources out there to train people. I've been tempted myself, honestly, to go back and learn Spanish in particular, just because of our population area. So thinking as a service provider lens, what can we do? What can we not do? Which we'll get to in terms of barriers to service and implications as well. So I will, yeah, go ahead.
Economic restrictions, like not paying people, their wage or counting them all.
Right. Yeah, you bring up a good point with economic situations as well, because we do see in research, that what this looks like, right, is if there are unequal opportunities to income, that does really have a risk factor with domestic violence and what that looks like with power and control. So even just as simply as income. And if we have a survivor who has to change states, go into hiding, what that may look like. Trying to get them back on their feet includes trying to help them get a job. And what does that look like for an immigrant who's maybe undocumented? And so these are all these things that we kind of have to think about. And like, yes, that original power control wheel is fantastic. However, it changes a little bit depending upon identity status. So thinking about barriers to service, we're thinking about, I don't know why that was separate, there we go. We're thinking about what stops a survivor from walking through our door. And for immigrant survivors in particular, right, we kind of talked about this, that inconsistent or poorly trained staff within the legal and social systems. If we don't know the process ourselves, how are we supposed to be able to help somebody who is very frantic and has a lot of questions? There is discrimination within law enforcement and the criminal justice system, right? So that barrier to service is important, and where there it is assist. But that our assistance sometimes doesn't really, change things. So how can we help, even if that survivor is not getting justice? There's also cultural norms and gender dynamics across various groups and how that plays into whether a survivor feels that they can or should even come forward. There's also this idea of the distrust of people and services from outside the community. Why would you want to talk to me, right? If I don't know your experiences or I don't know that impact that it's had on you. And also, right, there is this perceived or actual of help or options. Our services at Women Helping Women, right, we do have services for immigrants, but some people don't know that. It's a perceived that lack of our help that stopped them from coming through the door. Also, ineligibility, oh wow, that word, and what that looks like in eligibility. And what that means is some of our services that we can't provide for a survivor, whether that's applying for funding for first month's rent, some of our other social services, they sometimes are funded by various grants, and those grants are tied by legality purposes where it has to be a United States citizen. Not all of them, but there are some, right? So thinking about how that is impacting as well. And then also we talked about the limited language accessibility and that fear of deportation or that intimidating immigration policy. So what does that mean, right, when we're looking at the wheel, we're looking at those barriers? When we're thinking about service provision implications, and this can be for those of us who are in the field as professionals, but even, right, if someone as a friend just close to you. So we're thinking about the language in which the victim survivor is most comfortable discussing their case and access an appropriate interpreter if needed. We want to make sure when we speak to the victim survivor, we use empathetic body language when using an interpretation service. We want to be mindful of our own perception about cultural norms and the values surrounding those. We, right, sometimes retain our information from media, and media can have stereotypes, and we don't want to bring those stereotypes into our services. We also want to be able to respect cultural norms while sharing available options. We never want to be like, oh yeah, that's weird, here's what we can do. We need to be like, I understand that, I validate that, here are some options, let's see if we can find one that works with your system of beliefs. And we also really need to be aware of and advocate for immigrant victim survivors' rights. We want to make sure we do not want to use children as an interpreter. Hospitals sometimes will just be like, okay, cool, they have their kid speaks both language, like just talk to the child. It's like, no, right? We are not putting the survivor's child in that translator's circumstance. And also that's not really fair to the survivor because they probably don't want to say all the details to the child. And also, right, when using an interpreter, we really only want to speak and direct any questions to the survivor themselves and not the interpreter. Imagine if you were talking to somebody and then they only were talking to somebody else and not you as the person who's talking and the person who this is going through. So kind of to give another contextual update to the wheel, I want to talk a little bit about the LGBTQIA community. And what that means, right, is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning, intersex, asexual and agender, and other sexual minorities. Sexual minorities are groups of people whose sexual orientation, gender identity, or sexual characteristics are different from the presumed majority of the population, which currently are heterosexual, cisgender, and non-intersex individuals. Kind of just again to give you some statistics, I'm pretty sure this one is from 2015 if I'm remembering correctly. So pretty old, that's weird to say because I graduated from here in 2015. But as you can see, right, this is the difference, and this is binary with men and women, some of the different statistics. In terms of transgender and non-binary individuals, the most recent data that's come out has said about 54% of trans and non-binary individuals have experienced intimate partner violence at some point in their life. So there is a heightened sense of vulnerability for transgender survivors and any LGBTQIA survivor as well. So kind of similar to the first one, you have another blank wheel. You also have the filled out wheel of the packet if you want to kind of look at that and figure it out, but talk a little bit with your partner. This will be a little bit of a shorter time just to keep everybody's schedule on hand here. But think about the ways in which, like isolation, minimizing and blaming, different ways that if you were looking at the model and the power control wheel, what would you add to it or update it when keeping LGBTQ survivors in mind? Okay, so we can come back together. So looking at the wheel expanded here, this is pretty filled out and very extensive, which is awesome. But does anyone want to share what they talked about with their group or ways in which that they think certain things interact with the wheel? Yeah.
So we identified something would fall under several of the categories, but any kind of threatening to out that survivor at work or personally.
Yeah, 100%. So the idea of threatening to out someone, whether it's at work, with family, or personal, that is 100% a huge factor of and a limitation of barrier to service. Some people may not be out, right, whether that's at work, family, friends, what have you. And so when you're looking at an abusive relationship, that can be a big threat, right? I will tell them all about you, and it's usually used in a negative connotation regardless of the abusers, also like sexuality or gender identity. Anybody else? Any idea? Yeah, go ahead. Black shirt.
Under withholding, misuse or knowingly supports, kind of talks about, like especially in the bisexual community, how sometimes a partner will insinuate that they'd be open to more like diverse sexual experiences just because someone is interested in both genders, and kind of like pushing for that to happen, even though the partner has no such interest.
Yeah, 100% right. So particularly for people who identify as bisexual, that sexual promiscuity, right, stereotype is used to say, okay, let's more sexual partners. It also can be used for bi women and men, thinking about that jealousy technique of, oh, you're cheating on me, oh, you're going to cheat on me, with that stereotype, right, of being loose and fast if you're bi. I'm bi, so I can kind of comment on that of like, ugh, gross. Anybody else with any ideas? Yeah, go ahead.
This relates to the first point that was brought up about like threatening to out somebody. We talked about how that like isolation can be higher for an LGBTQ plus victim, because like they might not be out to their family, and so would be like isolated from that support. But then also like if they met this partner at like a shared LGBTQ group or like community, or like I don't know, center or something, or even just informal social scene, like if they were to come forward and like talk about their abuse, would they still have that community of support?
Yeah, that's a really good point to bring out, is this idea of community and what that looks like if you're coming forward. With the LGBTQ community, there's a high fear sometimes with, if I come forward about being abused, then all the stereotypes that are in the media are true, right? And people will see that as true. You also see this with Black women and Black men, just because of that angry, violent Black male stereotype. They're very scared about jeopardizing their community because of those stereotypes, 100%. Did I see another hand? Yeah, go ahead.
We talked about under the withholding category, if there's a transgender individual maybe withholding medication or just medical services that they might need for.
Yeah, 100%. So as you said, right, that idea of withholding medication, withholding hormones, particularly for our trans and non-binary survivors, that is used quite a bit. We do see that happening of withholding access to medical care and to gender-affirming medical care through abusive tactics. And then also, right, right, using that as threats and as put downs of then questioning their gender identity. Did I see another hand? Yes, go ahead.
This is mine, but something that we discussed here after is for the caregiver privilege, we were kind of talking about their roles in a relationship or their roles in the home.
Yeah, 100%, right? What do those gender roles look like in the home, and how does that impact? Okay. So yeah, those, I think we really covered kind of the ones that I wanted to hit to think about it, because for transgender individuals in particular, they may suffer from an even greater burden of that intimate partner violence. 54%, right? It's a staggering statistic to have. And looking at how society can contribute to that, and then how can we break down those barriers. So again, I don't know why this is separate. There we go. But when we're thinking about barriers to service, we're looking at that societal belief that domestic violence does not occur in LGBTQ relationships. That, I think, has started kind of going to the wayside. However, that was a very prominent thought in just social media and in just the community. Thinking about that potential homophobia from staff or service providers, or from non-LGBTQ domestic violence survivors that they may come into contact with. We do try to offer LGBTQ survivor support groups in particular because of this. We would like and hope, right, that everybody could come to the table as a survivor and find that commonality, but however, that sometimes just does not happen. Thinking about a fear of airing the problems, as we talked about, that the LGBTQ population will take away progress toward equality or flame the anti-LGBTQ bias. When we're looking at shelters, right, most domestic violence shelters are typically female only, and transgender individuals or male survivors may not be allowed entrance. At the Ion Center, our shelter was everybody and anybody, but that also created problems with sometimes with the community and sometimes with survivors themselves, right? What does that look like? Funding, right, was also a big contender for it. We're also looking at those low level of confidence in the effectiveness of the legal system. About 45% of survivors do not report the violence that they experience to police because they don't believe that will help them. And that's particularly for LGBTQ population. And again, that's a pretty high statistic itself, right? 45% of survivors do not feel comfortable reporting what's going on. And again, we're there to try to hopefully bridge that gap and be like, you don't have to do that, but you can talk to us and we can work you through it. So again, looking at the survivor service provision implications, we do always want to ask the client for their gender identification or pronoun and be comfortable sharing our own. I honestly just started in the hospital opening up with, hey, my name is Payton, I'm from Women Helping Women, my pronouns are she, they. And if it's important to the survivor, they will respond back with their own. And if it's not, it's not. But at least I've done my job to open that door for if it is a trans or non-binary survivor to feel comfortable in sharing their own. Looking at empowering clients to lead in identifying themselves and sharing their experiences. We really want to make sure that we do not assume gender identity or sexuality based upon appearance or privately held beliefs. We really want to make sure that we should not tell clients that, man, I would have never known that you were LGBTQ. That has happened. And also, right, we never want to ask the client for their birth name, dead name, or what their life was like pre-transition. So kind of just looking at those two, right, we're trying to just think about expanding that wheel, and from a service provider lens, right, what can we keep in mind when we walk into that hospital room and see or talk to a survivor who we know fits some social categories, and how can we adapt our care? Since we're running out of time, I did have one more wheel. It is in the in the packet, the handout, and because of like we're on St. Mary's campus with religion, there is an empowering control wheel that they updated to reflect upon Christianity and how religion can kind of intermix with power-based personal violence. I'll be around today, so like we can always talk about it in that one-on-one, but I really think that is a good way to kind of think of power-based personal violence from a different lens and how it interacts with many different parts of people's lives and how they come to getting help, whether it's to tell you as a friend, to a service provider, of what that looks like for them and that interaction. So I have my contact information up here as well. I know I'm running a little bit over, so I'm going to cut myself off, but thank you all for having me. And if you have any further questions, need any resources, anything like that, please feel free to email me work emails at the top, personal emails at the bottom, and then a link to my LinkedIn. So thank you all so much for having me.